My sermon today is entitled A Slanderous Report. That particular phrase is taken in the Bible from Romans chapter 3 and verse 8. We'll look at that a little bit later. But in this particular sermon, we're dealing with the subject of slander. And both the early church and the church today know what it's like to be slandered. And one of the things that I want to do today in this sermon is to show a little bit about how slander affected people in the Old Testament, but especially, and in the New Testament also, but also how it affected the early Christians, the early church. Slander is a lie that's meant to hurt. In Psalm 101 and verse 5, whoso privily slandereth his neighbor, him will I cut off. Him that hath a high look and a proud heart will I not suffer. According to Psalm 15:3, the citizen of Zion must be one that backbiteth or slandereth not with his tongue, nor doeth evil to his neighbor, nor taketh up a reproach against his neighbor. And then Paul wrote in 1 Timothy 3:11, even so must their wives be grave, not slanderers, sober, faithful in all things. Slander is falsehood or unproven rumor, maliciously told for the purpose of injuring the influence or reputation of another. And Christian people ought to be very careful about repeating something that they have heard about another. A slanderer could make little headway if he or she did not have help. Unfortunately, many people delight in hearing evil about other people. We're guilty of rejoicing in iniquity. And Paul voiced his disapproval in 1 Timothy 5:13 when he said, but withal they learn to be idle, wandering about from house to house, not only idle, but tattlers also in busybodies, speaking things of which they ought not. Much of our trouble in the church today is the result of this very thing. Reputations have been destroyed by slander, and the slanderer often has bitterness and hatred in the heart and untruth on the tongue. I want us today to explore in this sermon some things that are normally associated with a slanderous report. Number one, slander may involve twisted statements. Twisted statements. It's not uncommon for a slanderous report to be circulated about some person which another person wants to attack or to destroy. Sometimes people will take statements of preachers in our brotherhood, both living and dead, and will twist them to make them say something that they did not intend to say. That is a common way by which charges are brought against other people. Men will infer, they will suppose that what a man said leads to such and such a conclusion. Then they will charge their assumed conclusion upon another as if they actually hold that or teach that. It's an old axiom or principle that a man is not to be held responsible for the inference which we may draw from his doctrine, and that he is never to be represented as holding and teaching that which we suppose follows his doctrine. A man ought to be held accountable only for that which he actually teaches or avows. When I look at the early church, and study early church history, it is hard to believe, but our early Christian brothers and sisters were slandered as being cannibals. Cannibals. From the beginning, Christianity had no legal status. It was an illegal religion. And during these times of opposition, their meetings were held in secret. And under such conditions, it was natural for all kinds of suspicions to develop and rumors to be started. And the early Christians were charged as being cannibals. The pagans did not know what happened, but they heard that somebody was being eaten. That's what they heard. In Luke 22:19 and 20, it said of Jesus, and he took the bread and gave thanks and brake it, gave it unto them, saying, This is my body which is given for you. This do in remembrance of me. Likewise also the cup after supper, saying, This cup is the New Testament in my blood, which is shed for you. And the pagans twisted that and concluded that the Christians must be eating and drinking human flesh and blood. So, they spread the charge that the early Christians were cannibals. Not only that, the early Christians were charged as being guilty of incest. It is said that they were incestuous because they called each other brother and sisters. And they said they loved each other. And the Roman world would say to themselves, well, we all know what that means. And Christians would get together and they would have love feasts together and they would eat these meals in one another's homes. And since the Roman world had trouble finding accurate categories for this depth of brotherly and sisterly love, they said, oh, this must be incest. And so they slandered our brothers and sisters as being incestuous. Even the Apostle Paul had his enemies who twisted his statements. Let's look now at Romans chapter 3 and verse 8, from whence the title of our lesson comes. In Romans chapter 3 and verse 8, and not rather as we be slanderously reported, and as some affirm that we say, let us do evil that good may come, whose damnation is just. Paul's enemies were twisting and misrepresenting what he had written and said in order that they might destroy his influence among the people of God. And they were telling that Paul taught that Christian people ought to do things that are wrong in order that the grace of God might be abundant unto them. If the theory stated in the objection was correct, then, the more we sin, the more grace God will send, and the better off we all will be. How perverted is that? That's obviously false. Paul is teaching the principle that doing evil is never justified by God, even if ultimately some good may result from it. If you look at Romans 5 and verse 20, Paul taught, but where sin abounded, grace did much more abound. But Paul, while he taught that, never taught, let us do evil that good may come. And he says there was a slanderous report going around that he had taught that. He didn't teach that. And he said that the condemnation of those that had slanderously reported that he taught such a doctrine was just. So people slandered Jesus. They slandered the apostles. They slandered the early church by twisting their statements. Second of all, slander may involve character assassination. Let's look over in Jeremiah 9, verses 3 and 4. A slanderer not only willfully misrepresents what one teaches, but he'll often attack the character and the reputation of the one that he opposes. Jeremiah 9:3, Jeremiah wrote, "And they bent their tongues like their bow for lies, but they are not valiant for the truth upon the earth, for they proceed from evil to evil, and they know not me, saith the Lord. Take ye heed every one of his brother, and trust ye not in any brother, for every brother will utterly supplant, and every neighbor will walk with slanders." Well, the people to whom Jeremiah is referring would, he says, supplant a brother. They would slander a brother. He said they would bend their tongues like a bow to tell lies in order that they might destroy him. Looking to the New Testament in Acts chapter 6, verses 11 through 13, we read about how our good brother Stephen was slandered. In Acts 6:11, then they suborned men or paid men, which said, "We have heard him speak blasphemous words against Moses and against God." And they stirred up the people and the elders and the scribes, and came upon him and caught him and brought him to the council and set up false witnesses, which said, "This man ceaseth not to speak blasphemous words against this holy place and the law." Stephen was slandered. They even paid men to do it. And then look at Acts 24, 5 and 6. Paul was slandered. In Acts 24:5, they said, "For we have found this man a pestilent fellow, and a mover of sedition among all the Jews throughout the world, and a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes, who also hath gone about to profane the temple, whom we took and would have judged according to our law." This wasn't true. But even the Apostle Paul was slandered. The character assassination against the Christians reached epidemic proportions during the times of Roman persecution. The pagan gods were viewed as patrons who would extend some kindness toward a city. So as an act of loyalty, citizens of good standing would participate in various civic festivals that showed respect to one of these pagan gods. And Christians that would not give tribute to these gods appeared to be disloyal to their pagan neighbors. The popular notion held that disaster would strike if these pagan gods were neglected. In his apology, the writer Tertullian wrote, "If the Tiber floods the city, or if the Nile refuses to rise, or if the sky withholds the rain, if there is an earthquake, a famine, or pestilence, at once the cry is raised, 'Christians to the lion.'" Character assassination. Slander can be defamation of character, whether it's oral or written. It's a false report, maliciously uttered to injure the reputation of another. That's slander. And it destroys friendships. It disrupts churches. It creates envy and jealousy among brethren. And our culture in which we live is slandering us, recording and publishing statements about us that aren't true. that are hurtful. They give us labels that don't fit, and yet they stick and they sting. These are labels that are meant to make us look ridiculous and to feel awful. We've been called narrow-minded because we believe Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, the only way to heaven. We've been called cruel because we believe Jesus taught the existence of hell. We've been called fanatical because we believe the Bible really did come from God. We've been called anti-science because we believe the world came from God. And we've been called bigoted and hateful because we believe God created sexuality and marriage and gender. And because we try to base our beliefs upon sexuality, marriage, and gender on what the Bible teaches. People are engaging in character assassination against Christians today. But then third of all, slander may involve bad motives. Bad motives. Again, let me look into early church history for a minute. You take Emperor Nero, for example. It's AD 64. There's a great fire that occurs in the city of Rome. For 6 days and nights, the fire burns. The greater part of the city lays in ashes. The rumor circulates that Nero himself had caused the city to be set on fire. Well, this aroused great hatred among the people of Rome against the Emperor Nero. So to divert suspicion from himself, he accused the Christians of arson and ordered them to be punished. This slanderous accusation was not true. But large numbers of Christians were herded and arrested, and a terrible persecution followed. Thousands were put to death in the most cruel of ways, including crucifixion. And in this connection, Tacitus, the Roman historian, said, "Therefore, in order to disprove the rumor, Nero falsely accused culprits and subjected to most unusual punishments those whom, hated for their shameful deeds, the populace called Christians. First, those were seized who confessed that they were Christians. Then, upon their information, a great multitude was convicted, not so much upon the charge of setting fire to the city, as for hatred of the human race." The slanderer is often moved by bad motives. One of those is jealousy. He can't stand for someone else to be as successful as he is, and therefore he'll try to cut that other person down to size, he thinks. Let's go to Nehemiah chapter 6. Nehemiah chapter 6. Nehemiah was almost destroyed by an open letter that was written in the hands of Sanballat. And in the Orient, an open letter was an insult, and it's generally used for that purpose today. But this open letter brought to Nehemiah by Sanballat contained ugly accusations which were designed to slander him and injure him. And it almost destroyed Nehemiah. In Nehemiah 6, let's begin in verse 5. "Then sent Sanballat his servant unto me in like manner the 5th time with an open letter in his hand, wherein was written, It is reported among the heathen, and Gazmuz saith it, that thou and the Jews think to rebel. For which cause thou buildest the wall, that thou mayest be their king, according to these words. And thou hast also appointed prophets to preach of thee at Jerusalem, saying, There is a king in Judah, and now shall it be reported to the king according to these words. Come now, therefore, and let us take counsel together. Well, normally when you have correspondence to an official of state, that's going to be sealed, right? That's going to be private, right? No, this was an open letter for anybody to read. In other words, this was intended for more than the eyes and ears of Nehemiah. And this just shows you how rumors hurt. The allegations were twofold. Well, you're building these walls because you intend to make a rebellion. And then you've appointed prophets to proclaim you as King of Judah. All that was false. But Sanballat said he felt it was his duty to inform the king of Persia about this. But he's showing him this letter because he wants to hear Nehemiah's side in the matter. Look now at verse 8. Nehemiah says, Then I said unto him, saying, There are no such things done as thou sayest. But thou feignest them out of thine own heart, for they all made us afraid, saying, Their hands shall be weakened from the work, that it be not done. Now therefore, O God, strengthen my hands. You see how he dealt with it? He said there's not one thing about it that's true. He put the blame where it belonged, on them. He said, you made all this up. He saw just exactly what they were trying to do. They were just trying to weaken him and his work and stop the work. And then he took his heart to God, went to God in prayer, and said, Now therefore, O God, strengthen my hands. Why did they do this? Bad motives. Slander often results from bad motives. And then number 4. Slander may involve half-truths. Half-truths. Look at Numbers 14, 36 and 37. Slander is sometimes composed of a half-truth. People often take something that has some basis to it and then build on that and make a report that is hurtful. The people of God were forced to wander in the wilderness for many years because of slander. Numbers 14:36, and the men which Moses sent to search the land, who returned and made all the congregation to murmur against him by bringing up a slander upon the land. Even those men that did bring up the evil report upon the land died by the plague before the Lord. They brought a slander on the land of Palestine by relating only a half-truth. Were there obstacles in the land? Sure. But they were not insurmountable. And the evil report that they brought concerning the land caused great grief and trouble among Israel. In 1 Samuel 22, you have the case of Ahimelech. Ahimelech died as a victim of slander. Doeg the Edomite accused Ahimelech of unlawfully aiding David as he was fleeing from Saul. Now Ahimelech was a priest of God. David came to him, asked for his help, and he gave him help. And he told Saul that he did that because he regarded David as a faithful servant, as one who was son-in-law of the king, as one who went at the bidding of King Saul, and was taken into the counsel of Saul, and was honorable in all of Saul's house. So Ahimelech was not a traitor. He was sincere in what he was doing. But Doeg slandered him and accused him of betraying the king and insinuated that he was a total enemy of the kingdom of Israel. And there in 1 Samuel 22, when Doeg said that Ahimelech had aided David, he told the truth. Was that the truth? Yes, he aided David. But he didn't tell the whole truth. He told a half-truth. He did not tell that Ahimelech thought that he was doing the right thing. And so he impeached the motives of Ahimelech and told only a half-truth and thus slandered him. And then at the command of Saul, Doeg took a sword and run him through. Never more to serve as priest. And his untimely death was due to no fault of his own, but because of a lying tongue. Let me go back to church history once more as I conclude. Can you believe that the early Christians were charged with atheism? Yes. Charged as cannibals, we've talked about that. Charged with incest, we've talked about that. Charged as atheist? Well, that was due to the fact that they rejected those old Roman pagan gods, and one simply could not reject the gods without arousing scorn as some kind of social misfit. For the pagan, every meal began with a liquid offering and a prayer to the pagan gods. The Christian could not share in that. Most heathen feasts and social parties were held in the temple after sacrifice had been made. And the invitation was usually to dine at the table of some god. A Christian could do that. Could go to such feast. The Romans could not conceive of religious services without temples and images and altars and sacrifices. Christians had no temples. Christians had no altars. They prayed to and worshiped an unseen God. Romans could not understand that, and so they said of the Christians, "Away with the atheist," and slandered them. Well, it was true they didn't believe in the pagan gods, but it was false that they were atheists. They believed in the one true God. We Christians believe in the one God, the creator of all things. Friends, I hope this study of the Bible will show you that slander is a sin. And those who follow Christ are told to speak evil of no man, to be no brawlers but gentle, showing meekness unto all men, Titus 3 and verse 2. And when a brother falls into sin, it's not our duty to crush him down, but to lift him up. There's enough heartache in the world without adding the sin of slander. Remember, we're all in need of divine mercy and forgiveness from God. If you're here today and not a child of God, you can become one by faith in Christ Jesus. For as many of you as have been baptized into Christ have put on Christ, Galatians 3:26 and 27. If you're here today and you have sin on your heart, and it needs to be forgiven by the blood of Jesus, and you want to come repenting of it, confessing it, we'll pray with you and for you. Come as together we stand and sing.